into the Saudi Arabian skies to successfully meet and destroy an incoming Iraqi Scud.
Our coverage of the war in the Gulf continues. I'm Molly McCoy at CNN Center in Atlanta.
And I'm David French, joining Molly from Washington. The ground war is now 20 hours old, but details of the massive operation to free Kuwait still are scarce. We do know soldiers from the 30-nation Allied coalition have plowed into Kuwait and reportedly are moving north quickly, faster than the Iraqis expected. And U.S. officials say the assault is moving twice as fast as they expected. U.S. officials say troops have reached the outskirts of Kuwait City now and describe Allied casualties as extremely light. CNN has learned 11 U.S. soldiers were killed during the first stage of the war, launched at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, U.S. time, Saturday, after Iraq refused to withdraw. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein says the Allied ground campaign is failing, and he is urging his troops to fight to the death. However, thousands of them have been taken prisoner instead, and Desert Storm Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf said 5,500 Iraqi soldiers were captured in just the first 12 hours, and there are reports hundreds more have been taken since. The battle is being fought from the sea, from the air, and on the land. And we have more on the first day of the ground war from Sandy Gall.
At dawn this morning, Saudi troops started moving across the desert on their mission to liberate Kuwait. Hundreds of tanks and armored personnel carriers, their crews raring to go, headed for the Kuwaiti border, apparently without a care in the world. Artillery and rocket launchers hammered the Iraqi defenses. Saudi armor moving across the desert on the first day of the ground offensive towards Kuwait. Just a few hundred yards up there is the berm, the big sand defenses put up by the Iraqis. They've smashed away through that and they're on their way now. Saddam Hussein's much vaunted berm, a defensive barrier of sand bridges and ditches, turned out to be an anticlimax. There was no flaming oil as threatened by Saddam, no Iraqi resistance. This was the historic moment as the great army of Saudi tanks and armored personnel carriers ground their way onto Kuwaiti soil and fanned out across the desert. One Saudi soldier's views about Saddam seemed to be typical.
We will fight him, we will kill him, we will destroy his army and his force.
The operation went like clockwork, the armored columns following a prearranged plan, advancing on a broad front without meeting any resistance for several miles. They passed a litter of empty shell cases and shortly afterwards a shattered heavy artillery piece. Then they crossed the highway and rolled off across the desert again. 10 or 15 miles inside Kuwait, the lead Saudi column captured their first Iraqi prisoners. A white flag flew from the top of a ridge. One soldier held out a leaflet calling on Iraqi troops to surrender. Another, slightly wounded, kissed one of his captors in relief. Several had been hurt in the brief battle that preceded their capture. Disarmed and their hands bound, they were led off to captivity. Most of them seemed to be glad it was all over. At least they were alive and had managed to avoid what Saddam boasted would be the mother of all battles. Sandy Gall, ITN, with Saudi troops inside Kuwait.
Here in Saudi Arabia, the ground campaign against Kuwait is a little over 18 hours old. So far, from what we've been able to understand, it's met with a good deal of success. The latest reports we've got, quoting military and Pentagon sources, claim that the Allied commanders have ordered their commanders in the field to accelerate the pace of the ground offensive in order to punch through all the Iraqi defenses. One big problem, though, is they're saying that there may be too many Iraqi prisoners being taken, and that could bog things down. They do note, however, that the elite Republican Guard units of the Iraqi Army, the ones everyone's talked about for weeks, still have not been met, still have not been engaged to any great degree, and they say that is when the real test will come. Overall, though, General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of Operation Desert Storm, says so far the first-day objectives have been met.
U.S. forces in this morning's attack were U.S. Marines, Army paratroopers, Army Air Assault Forces, and Army Special Forces. These forces, along with French and Arab forces, have already reached all of their first-day objectives and are continuing their attack. Early this afternoon, U.S. Army Mechanized and Armored Forces, along with the forces of the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Egypt, and Syria, also launched attacks, and they are moving north with great speed.
That great speed continues, but Iraq is still, as one Wire report put it, in the war business. They fired a Scud missile at Saudi Arabia a few hours ago. It was intercepted by a Patriot missile. So far, resistance has reportedly been light, but Pentagon planners are not taking the Iraqi army lightly at all. They say they still may have plenty of fight left in them. We have some late pictures in now, and we'll take a look at how the Marines drove into Kuwait on this, the first day of a ground war. The 2nd Marine Division's push into Kuwait began before the sun came up. By the time it was daylight, shortly after 6, the Marines were inside Iraqi-occupied Kuwait. As the convoy ground through the desert, rain started to fall. There was concern about Iraqi chemical weapons.
Possible chemical agents.
But generally, the Leathernecks sped into Kuwait without meeting any Iraqi resistance. As they drove along, smoke and fires from the hundreds of oil fields set alight by Iraqi troops came into view. Occasionally, the Marines traded fire with scattered Iraqi positions. Marine engineers threw out explosive line charges to detonate mines. In the distance, the Marines in the convoy could see Iraqi soldiers by the dozens surrendering. But it wasn't all smooth going. The convoy ground to a halt after one of the Marine Humvees hit a mine. The concussion knocked one Marine out for a second.
I think I was unconscious. The next thing I knew, I was running, and I just fell down on the deck, and my head was hurting extremely.
The convoy slowly began rolling again, passing by abandoned Iraqi anti-aircraft emplacements and armored vehicles scorched by the relentless air war. Then a scene that amazed even the Marines, lines of hundreds of Iraqi soldiers surrendering.
Are we bad? Are we bad?
The Iraqi POWs marched with their hands up, trudging past burning oil fields and abandoned defensive positions. Not all the Marines believed it would continue to be that easy.
A little easier than I thought it would be. You know, I'd heard a lot of optimistic reports, but I'm not exactly an optimist at times, so I was real pleased with how it went.
But to their amazement, as the day wore on, it did continue to be that easy, as more and more Iraqis decided not to fight. So far, the last figures we had were from a briefing here in Saudi Arabia several hours ago, and those figures were 5,500 plus Iraqi prisoners of war taken so far. CNN's Wolf Blitzer reported from the Pentagon a few hours ago 11 U.S. soldiers had been killed in the first stage of the ground war. So far, no firm word from the front about exactly what's going on now, but one thing might tell you what's going on, in that the Pentagon initially said there would be a 36 to 48-hour news blackout, no news at all coming from the front. None of these pool tapes we've seen, no briefings. Instead, less than 18 hours after the offensive began, we've been getting briefings. We're now getting the pool tape, which would seem to indicate at least that Allied commanders are fairly confident things are going their way. But again, they stress the elite Republican Guard units have not been met and engaged yet, and the battle for Kuwait City, which could be house to house, has not started yet. Charles Jaco, CNN, reporting live.
But it's being kept very busy on its own, as you said. The infiltrator crossed the border from Jordan. He shot and killed an Israeli soldier, and then the infiltrator was killed by return fire. This is the first Israeli soldier who has been killed by an infiltrator this year. The soldier was not necessarily a Jew. He was an Arab, a Bedouin Arab, who was recruited by the Israeli Defense Force. Sometimes Bedouins are used as trackers because they are so intimately familiar with the desert and with the terrain. Elsewhere, Israel continues to put pressure on the Palestinians. Israeli soldiers searched and then closed the offices of Palestinian leader Faisal Husseini. Israel contends Husseini has been a strong supporter of the PLO and of its chairman Yasser Arafat. Israeli officials also say Husseini's office was being used to support the activities of the PLO, which is illegal in Israel and the occupied territories. Husseini denies it.
The police came with orders to close 2 offices of the Arab Studies Society. The place here of the documents and the library, and the other one, the office of the tourism and geography.
And what did they take away? What did they find?
Nothing. I believe nothing. I believe that it's just a war against the Palestinian people, against the culture of the Palestinian people. That's it.
Palestinian demonstrators defied a tight curfew and briefly marched in the area of the Arab village of Ramallah. Palestinians have been under curfew since mid-January. There has been some easing up, but that ended with the start of the ground campaign Saturday night. Amid the conflict, a marriage. This couple, immigrants from the Soviet Union, decided to marry in spite of the war. Just one more sign. The Israeli government hopes that things here will stay pretty close to normal, if you will. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir has been keeping close tabs on how the war is going, especially with the capture of so many Iraqi troops. Though Shamir is quick to point out the problem is not necessarily Saddam Hussein's troops, but the problem is Saddam Hussein himself. Greg Lefebvre, CNN Live, Jerusalem.